Alright, next up, let's get talking about suspending your dominant seventh chords. But first, we have to talk about what is a suspension. Or really, there's actually a couple of types, so we're going to go through both. So there's something called sus2 and sus4. For the younger generation that knows sus as being suspicious, we're not suspicious of these chords, they are suspended. So let's take a look at what's going on under the hood of these sus chords. So simply put, you can suspend a major chord, a minor chord, a seventh chord, any chord that has a third. So when we're looking at C major, C, E, G, our third of that chord is the middle note, E. Likewise, when we have C minor, we have E flat as our third. Sus2 and sus4 refers to suspending or essentially moving the third of the chord up one note within the diatonic scale or down one note. So the first 5 notes of C major, C, D, E, F, G, are very similar to the first 5 notes of C minor, C, D, E flat, F, G. Only one note changes. E becomes E flat. So when we go to suspend this third, E or E flat, we can suspend it up to the 4th note of either of those scales. They're the same note. So F, that would be your sus4 because that's the 4th note of those scales. Or you can suspend them down as a sus2. The 2nd note of C major and C minor is a D, so sus2 would be in replacement of the 3rd E or E flat. Basically, instead of the 1st, 3rd, and 5th note of a major or a minor scale, you have the 1st, 4th, and 5th, or 1st, 2nd, and 5th. So, sus4, sus2. If that's making sense so far, let's jump forward into how we can now suspend a dominant 7th chord and the function of how we can use that suspension. Now, before we get talking about how you can suspend a dominant 7th chord, I first want to mention that there is a sort of default sus. Like if you see C sus, what are they referring to? Is it sus2? Is it sus4? Well, 4 tends to be the default. And the way I explain it to my students is, imagine I said you walked into a room and there was a piano suspended in the room. Would you picture it suspended above you or below you? Most likely above. It's suspended. Some ropes have been pulled, the piano is up, it's suspended up into the air. So the default suspension, if that's any help in terms of remembering, goes up from the 3rd to the 4th. So the default is that sus4. So when we say sus, I want you thinking sus4, they're essentially the same thing. Jazz musicians will quite often use both, but I digress, we won't go into that territory. Also, there are other types of suspensions. If you've studied classical counterpoint, you'll recognize that suspensions can be used in all types of areas leading into new harmony, but for the sake of this class, we're just going to be talking about the regular old sus or sus4. But we are applying it to a dominant 7th chord, so let's start to jump into that territory. Dominant 7th chord again being a major chord with a flat 7 or a minor 7. Again, we're taking the 3rd of the chord, in this case B, and suspending it up to a C. Now in classical music, there's a really common sort of sus4 on this dominant, to the regular dominant, and then back to the 1 chord. And what this gives us is one of the most common melodic phrases, which is do, ti, do. So here it is. Hear that little do, ti, do? It's like mi, re, do, do, ti, do. These are really common ways to finish a melodic phrase because of how popular the perfect cadence is 1-5-1. But instead of 1-5-1, we're now trying something like 5 sus, 5-1. So on our dominant 7th chord, again, in this case we have G, the 4th note C, D, and F, and quite often this will resolve to a dominant 7th chord. Now from there, you could choose to go back to a 1 major or minor, or you could move deceptively. Sus, dominant, and then to one of our more romantic sounding options. However, what I really love about the dominant sus chord in romantic music is it quite often doesn't resolve. It'll just linger and then move somewhere else. So we end up getting sounds like 5-7 sus to 2nd inversion, minor 7 flat 5, or 5-7 sus to a 1st inversion, minor 7 flat 5, which is the same as our 4 minor 6, or 5-7 sus to a 1 chord, could be major or minor, throw some color on there, but it doesn't have to resolve 5/7 sus to the dominant chord and then somewhere else. In other words, think of it just as a replacement of the dominant 7th chord. It's more lingering tension, and it's a little bit more color, but I didn't include this in the last class where we're coloring dominant 7th chords because it's not truly a dominant 7th chord, right? We don't have that major third. So I'm treating it as a little bit of its own sort of sound, just so you can sort of compartmentalize coloring a dominant 7th chord, having a suspended dominant 7th chord, and then eventually, maybe, combining the two together. Now, if you were to combine them together, I'd recommend coloring it with a flat 9. So we have G dominant 7, sus 4, or 5/7 sus, same idea. We're going to add a flat, the flat 9. Let's put it in a progression. We're going to play 1, 4, 5, and then we're going to bring that to a deceptive flat 6, which is our second inversion, minor 7, flat 5. I'll go through it. So we have the minor 7 flat 5, we have D, minor 7 flat 5, first inversion, second inversion, and this chord is one of my favorites, but it's a mouthful. Again, we're not going to call it a flat 6, major 6, flat 5, it's too much. So second inversion, minor 7 flat 5. We're here, up 2 inversions. Great place to move in terms of a deceptive cadence. So here's the sound without me talking. Then you could take that somewhere else, maybe. And then back. All right, so we have this dominant 7th chord that's so popular in classical music, romantic music, and every new genre that you can think of, pop, rock, soul, funk, jazz. It's really, really popular. This suspension on the dominant 7th chord is also a pretty common movement, but to not resolve it is kind of what makes this unique. To take that suspended chord and move it deceptively somewhere else, or maybe just come straight back to the 1, can be such a fun sound to work with. And again, adding a flat 9, now we're really in that romantic harmony territory, so I'd recommend working your way up to this. First, work through deceptive cadences with regular dominant 7th chords, then try it with the suspended version of these chords, and then see if you like the sound of adding a flat 9 on top of all that. So that's it for this class on dominant 7 sus chords. I'll catch you in the next class.